Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Wednesday at 9 p.m. RPM's about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Each week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in New York City. Join the movement at Socialists.NYC.
Hey, what's up, New York City? This is Amy Wilson. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute live on WBAI. We are a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the United States, with 90,000 members nationwide. New York City-DSA is its biggest chapter. We are run by our 7,000-plus members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. Once again, my name is Amy Wilson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a member of DSA of North Brooklyn. And this time, 3 years ago, my home branch of North Brooklyn DSA, as well as DSA members and allies from all over the city, were working hard on the grassroots campaign of Julia Salazar for state senate from New York's 18th district. 3 years later, Senator Salazar is serving her second term in Albany and continuing to make waves by advocating for redistributive legislation that places working people and tenants first. On tonight's show, we'll hear from the senator about her surprise visits to New York State correctional facilities and what she's learned from seeing our carceral system as a first-hand observer. We're also joined live by Ramon Pebenito, organizing director from the Salazar office. We'll be chatting live and taking your calls later in the hour, so please stick around. But first, the headlines with Chris Carr.
A report by New York Attorney General Letitia James found that Governor Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women, including current and former government workers, and retaliated against at least one woman for making her complaints public in a much-anticipated report released this past Tuesday. After many calls for his resignation, including from President Biden, Cuomo announced his resignation on Tuesday. Melissa DeRosa, one of Governor Cuomo's top aides, resigned on Sunday. The Attorney General's report found that DeRosa spearheaded efforts to retaliate against one of the women who accused Cuomo of sexual harassment. Many nonprofit executives and leaders are pushing back against a law the City Council passed that would make it easier for nonprofit workers to unionize. The real estate industry is concerned about the scheduled expiration of the 421A tax break for private developers in June of 2022. Since the last time the tax break was reauthorized, in January 2016, the state legislature has gotten far more progressive, and housing activists have long fought to eliminate 421A. Though Mayor de Blasio announced that the city will cease using solitary confinement, the Board of Corrections' newly released plans show that city jails would still use a system that isolates inmates for the vast majority of the day. New York City will become the first U.S. city to require workers and customers to show proof of vaccination for indoor activities, including indoor dining, gyms, and performances. The program is similar to mandates in France and Italy and will begin enforcement in mid-September, when public schools and many offices are set to return to in-person. Some New York City schools may not be big enough to follow the distancing guidelines issued by the CDC. Despite a City Council recommendation to tear down the triple cantilever section of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that the City Department of Transportation believes it can be preserved for another 20 years. A new law in Nassau County will allow police officers to sue citizens who, quote, alarm or seriously annoy them. In election news, unofficial results of a manual recount show progressive challenger Christian Richardson Jordan beating incumbent Harlem Council member Bill Perkins. The Board of Elections is set to certify the results on August 17th. district leaders associated with the New Kings Democrats trying to bring more transparency to this year's judicial nomination process, but Brooklyn Democratic Party Chair Rotnese Brashat Himaline ensured that the recommendations included traditional party donors. Mayor de Blasio officially endorsed Eric Adams for mayor at a rally outside City Hall. This is Chris Carr, and those are the headlines. Now back to the studio for tonight's show.
Thank you, Chris. Our headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by New York City-DSA's Electoral Working Group covering local politics and radical activism. You can subscribe at thethorn.nyc. This week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 2021 report on human-induced climate catastrophe. As climate organizers and directly affected communities have been saying for years, the news is not good and the time is now to take radical action. Regular listeners of Revolutions Per Minute know that we've been covering the local struggle to stop a new fracked gas pipeline through North Brooklyn for nearly 2 years now. And this past weekend, Senator Julia Salazar stood with Brooklyn community members who are fighting back against National Grid's plan to raise monthly bills for 1.9 million downstate customers to pay for that new pipeline. Here's what Senator Salazar had to say.
What we need all of you to do now that you know about this is join us. Right. Join this movement to stop the North Brooklyn pipeline, and even further, systemically, we need to fight for public power. It would be enough for this to be about North Brooklyn, for this to be about Brooklyn, but it is a fight that is even bigger than Brooklyn. And companies, corporations like National Grid, as long as they have a monopoly over our power grid and our energy in our state, in our country, this is going to continue, and it cannot continue.
You just heard Senator Julia Salazar at last Saturday's rally to stop the North Brooklyn pipeline. We'll hear more from Senator Salazar in just a minute, but first, I'd love to welcome tonight's live guest. Hello, Ramon. Welcome.
Hi, Amy. So thanks so much for having me today.
Yes, it's lovely to have you and to hear you speak in this context as your role as the organizing director in the Julia Salazar office. So we will be talking more about your work there and some recent developments that you've been involved with. But before we dig into that topic for tonight's show, I'd love to give you a chance to give any comments or reactions to this week's big political news. Of course, the resignation of Governor Andrew Cuomo that we saw yesterday. What are your thoughts on this, and what do you think it means for the socialist movement in New York State?
Thank you so much. So as far as the announcement, as far as the near-term impact of that, it is a small step towards a measure, just a fragment of the justice that is owed to those who have survived working for and being harassed and abused by Andrew Cuomo. That's unmistakable. But I want to join others, by saying that accountability, real accountability, is not his resignation. I agree with those who are advocating vociferously for him to be impeached during this 2-week and less window before his official last day. Trump had 7 days left when he was impeached. The same applies. Moreover, we in the socialist movement, of course, want to give Kathy Hochul a chance to start over and restore some semblance of balance of power up in Albany. As we know, it's almost entirely a one-man show with Andrew Cuomo at the head of the car. And we have a new chance, we have an opportunity. With an obstructionist, as it pertains to the socialist movement, look, with an obstructionist, pro-Wall Street, pro-real estate, pro-carceral governor, with one socialist in Albany, Julia Salazar, we were able to accomplish so much by working in coalition with other progressive organizations and advocates. Now, with the new socialists, the great slate that was elected and the wonderful victories of 2020, even more was accomplished, highlighted by the success against Halt, which has to be protected because as we've been finding out, they've been adapting in our correctional facilities. So we'll continue to be militant and vigilant along that. But yeah, we can do even more now. That's my takeaway. Ever more now with a less obstructionist governor. Am I saying it's going to be perfect or ideal? No, but a huge piece of the problem of balance up in Albany has been, partially improved.
Well, thank you for those comments. And when you say halt, that is the very solitary confinement bill that we heard about during tonight's headlines. Is that correct?
Exactly, exactly. The infamous boot, the infamous parking lot shaped boot in which, hundreds of thousands, if not millions over the past several decades in New York State correctional facilities have been inhumanely forced to live and endure a form of torture by the UN. And so they have adapted with certain workarounds and loopholes. And so the senator, even when on the date that Andrew Cuomo first announced that he, last week or 2 weeks ago, when the report came out a week ago, Senator Salazar was actually speaking on this issue.
And we're going to be hearing more about the senator's work on the Crime Victims, Crime and Corrections Committee from her momentarily, and more from you, Ramon, later in the show. So thanks again for being with us tonight. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting 99.5 FM, streaming on your favorite podcast app. Today we're talking about the state-sponsored violence of the carceral system and how socialists are fighting back. Senator Julia Salazar of New York District 18 is an NYC-DSA member who in September 2018 became the youngest woman elected to the New York State Senate, as well as the first elected socialist legislator in New York in almost 100 years. She is the chair of the Women's Issues Committee in our state Senate, as well as the chair of the Crime Victims, Crime and Corrections Committee. I spoke to Senator Salazar about this year's legislative session and how she's advancing the cause of decarceration through her work in Albany. Let's hear what she had to say. Good evening, Senator. Thanks so much for joining us on Revolutions Per Minute.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy. It's great to be back.
Tonight's show, we're focusing on bureaucratic violence and violence caused by the state, which unfortunately is something that you have a deep knowledge of in your position as the chair of the Crime Victims, Crime and Corrections Committee in the New York State Senate. But first, before we dig into that, I'd love to hear just a little bit from you on how the legislative session went up in Albany and whether you've seen any changes now that you're in your second term and we do have a couple of more socialists in office up there with you.
Yeah. So, when I reflect on this year's legislative session, I have a couple of takeaways, but specifically from what we were able to win in the state budget process. Our economic justice agenda as NYC-DSA and as socialists in elected office is really related to every single policy issue, because every area of public policy, everything that impacts New Yorkers' lives has been negatively impacted by austerity. For our government to eventually implement policies that we desperately need, like the New York Health Act, which would be universal health care, of course, to enact a new deal for CUNY, for our public university system, for us to achieve our climate justice goals, and to achieve public power, to make that a reality instead of having to rely on corporations to provide our power to people and have control of the power grid in our state. These things and more, all of this, our policy agenda can only become a reality if our state generates revenue and invests in our people and abandons the legacy of austerity. The austerity of budget cuts has persisted throughout the Cuomo administration, and it's the result of the state's failure to implement a truly progressive tax structure. And that's something that we talk about all the time as socialists, that it's the state's failure to demand that the wealthy individuals in our state actually bear the tax burden that they can more than afford to bear, instead of putting it on everyday New Yorkers. This is the understanding that drove the Invest in Our New York campaign, which NYC-DSA played a critical leading role in, an indispensable role in. And we were able to work in coalition with those of us as socialists in the legislature and our thousands of members in New York City. Were able to work in a coalition with groups from across the state that focus on all sorts of policy issues that socialists also care deeply about. And together we were able to fight for the common goal of taxing the rich to actually invest in these things that we desperately need. And while this fight is still going to continue every year in the budget process, we were able to win billions of dollars in new tax revenue and raise more revenue for our state and combat austerity more than we have seen in any state budget in any of our lifetimes. So it was a really big deal. And the lesson that I take away from that is that we are most effective and successful in achieving these material gains for New Yorkers, for our neighbors, for ourselves, when we can come together around this common goal. And when we can put because all of these are socialist ideas. This is, in some ways, these are priority campaigns for us even, right? Fighting to pass the New York Health Act, which is essentially state level Medicare for all. These are things that we are deeply invested in, that other people, even if they don't consider themselves to be socialists, recognize as critically important. And so if we can come together with other people and not only just be more effective as we're joining forces and we're more powerful together, but also demonstrate to people that this is actually what socialism is. This is what we are fighting for. Then we are at once achieving material gains for everyday New Yorkers, which is really important to all of us, and we are building our socialist project.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's incredible to think of how far that project has come since you first ran in 2018. Now you were the first socialist legislator elected in some number of years. And now we have how many? 5, 6 up there with you?
6 at least.
6. So, and maybe more to come in the next electoral cycle. So it is important to, celebrate those gains, even though we do have so much further to go. And when you talk about austerity and the way we've seen those effects playing out in New York City and New York State over the last years, certainly the last year and a half with the COVID pandemic, it puts me in mind of your last appearance on Revolutions Per Minute, where we were talking about disinvestment in NYCHA and the way that residents of NYCHA public housing had suffered during the beginning of the pandemic and ongoing. So just puts you in mind of all the different ways that the state can either serve or fail its people.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is that austerity is always linked to the ways in which our state has failed our people. Everything that we need requires investment and resources, and we know that as socialists. But for too long, for whatever reason, for a lot of reasons, the governor and a lot of folks who have power in Albany have insisted on just cutting the budget and trimming more and more from the resources that everyday New Yorkers and working people rely on.
Mm-hmm. So let's dig in a little bit more to a project that you've been undertaking for the past several months, dating back to winter, spring of this year, which is exercising your right as an elected official to visit incarceration facilities in New York State. So talk to me a little bit about your inspiration behind that work and what you've observed so far.
I became the chair of the Crime Victims, Crime and Correction Committee in the state Senate earlier this year in February. And here in New York, legislators have the lawful ability to visit any jail, prison, or detention center in the state at any time. It's codified in law. And this is a critically important privilege that legislators should be taking advantage of as much as possible. It's not just a privilege that I have as the chair, but naturally, as the chair of the Correction Committee, it's a high priority for me. And the purpose of visiting these facilities for me is essentially oversight and accountability. They are also, these visits, serving as a way of opening the minds and hearts of legislators who are not compelled to think about our carceral system and the harms of mass incarceration. I've witnessed legislators being compelled to act with urgency because they personally visited a prison and saw how urgent it is for us to pass parole justice, for example, which is inherently decarceral legislation. It's really important to me. When I go to these facilities, I have the opportunity to speak directly to the incarcerated individuals about what's happening there. And I have the opportunity to have confidential conversations with them away from the correction officers and ask them if they feel safe, basic questions, and then also more detailed questions where I'm sort of monitoring the implementation of policies. Earlier this year, we passed the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, a bill that I had been the lead sponsor of in the state Senate to finally end long-term solitary confinement in New York State. We want to take that even further, but it was the result of about an 8-year-long campaign from people who have been directly impacted, survivors of solitary confinement, the family members of people who did not survive, but who succumbed to the harms of solitary confinement. This legislation that we passed, we're now in the implementation period. And it's so important for legislators to be present in facilities, to be making sure that that they're actually following the law, and that our prison system is implementing these changes. Now, that is not the end of solitary confinement is about making sure that right now in our current system where people unfortunately are being incarcerated, that they are being treated as humanely as possible. It's minimizing the harm that can be caused, and the harm that is caused by incarceration is just tremendous. So that's important, but additionally, we're basically seeking to educate other legislators, go inside and when we leave the facilities, bring the knowledge of what is happening inside to the public, so that people can understand really how severe this situation is. It's difficult to fathom for some people when they haven't seen it themselves. So it's both a means of oversight, but also when people see the cruelty in our jails and prisons and correctional facilities, they are moved to act, and I think they begin to understand, if they didn't already understand, the problems with the carceral system and why mass incarceration is cruel and even evil, that it's making our society sick. And then additionally, I think it motivates people, and it certainly motivates me as someone who believes that prisons as they exist in the United States should be abolished. Even coming from the position that I have, I feel as though I'm moved every time that I visit a facility, that you can't go to a prison and visit incarcerated people and leave the same as you were when you came. And that isn't to say that we want to be traumatizing people, but that it's important for us to be in solidarity with people who are on the inside, and to take those experiences and not just observe what's happening, but to take them and actually create meaningful change from them and motivate us to put an end to the cruelty of incarceration in our state.
Right, and you are somebody who is in the unique or relatively unique position at this time of having the power to make legislative change, or to collectively affect legislative change with your fellows in the state Senate. Although, as we know, this movement goes so far beyond any one individual. And it truly is a movement that, as you say, has been led for a long time by people who come from the most directly impacted, formerly incarcerated people themselves, families of formerly incarcerated people. So in your position as an elected official, a New York State Senator, how do you see what you're doing as connected to a larger movement for abolition and decarceration? And I'll throw a curveball question at you as well. Who out there is doing work that you personally are inspired by when you look at this arm of your organizing?
Well, the work that we do in the committee, for example, the Crime Victims, Crime and Correction Committee, although it also spans the legislature, includes fighting for legislation such as a bill called the Elder Parole Bill, which would make sure that individuals who are elders, which is defined as age 55 or older in our state prison system, have the opportunity for parole after a certain amount of time, and once they reach the age of 55, regardless of their original sentence. So there are people that I meet in DOCS facilities in our state prison system who have been incarcerated for longer than I've been alive, which is really a heavy thing to consider when I meet folks. There are a lot of people who are serving life sentences without an opportunity for parole, something that I don't think should exist. It's cruel. It doesn't exist in a lot of countries that are similar to the United States around the world. And you know, when we visit these facilities and we consider this legislation, it is truly decarceral. The goal is for people who otherwise would not have the opportunity to live, to enjoy their liberty again, to leave prison, that they would have the opportunity to. And that includes the Elder Parole Bill, the Fair and Timely Parole Bill. We passed legislation this session called the Less is More Act, which seeks to reduce recidivism, or the phenomenon of people returning to jail and prison and just being caught in the cycle of the criminal legal system. That was legislation sponsored by our comrade, Assemblymember Farah Souffrant Forrest. And we were able to pass that legislation that would make a profound difference in the lives of a lot of people. There's so much that we can do legislatively to drastically reduce the number of people who end up incarcerated in New York State. And so that really is the most important work I think that I can be doing through this committee chairmanship. Additionally, there are so many advocates who are doing the great work. NYC-DSA's Racial Justice Working Group has done tremendous advocacy when it comes to decarceral legislation, as well as seeking to address some of these problems at their root, which is the very moment in which people first interact with the criminal legal system, which usually is through racist policing and the police state. So, you know, there are all these different ways that people can affect change when it comes to criminal legal reform, and specifically decarceration and seeking to end mass incarceration. I'm also really inspired by the Alternatives to Solitary Confinement campaign, the RAP campaign, Release Aging People in Prison campaign, also the coalition, the Center for Community Alternatives. They are doing tremendous work when it comes to fighting for decarceral legislation, as well as things that people might not necessarily always think of when we talk about mass incarceration and reducing mass incarceration. I have a bill that I introduced with Assemblymember Yulene Yu called the End Predatory Court Fees Act, that seeks to confront and eliminate so many of these fines, fees, and surcharges that are sort of kicking people while they're down. They criminalize poverty, and they lead to people having to go back to court, even back to jail or prison, once they are involved in the criminal legal system. That's something that I've been working closely with the Center for Community Alternatives on. But there really is just a lot of people who have chosen to courageously use their own firsthand experiences with the criminal legal system to try to change it. And those are the advocates who I love to work with the most.
Well, thank you so much for your work and for visiting us again here on Revolutions Per Minute. It's always a pleasure to have you. And I think, as we're going into this mayoral race with Eric Adams versus Curtis Lewa, cop versus cop, essentially, I think this type of work that seeks to limit the harms and throw sand in the gears of the carceral state, which is really how I perceive what you're doing, is taking individuals or small groups or facilities or fines and fees and striking at them as others work on other parts of the movement, and really seeing this as a collaborative effort for justice and liberation for all. I thank you so much for your work again, and do you have any final parting thoughts for our Revolutions Per Minute audience?
I just really appreciate the opportunity to share with all of you, and thank you so much, Amy, for the work that you do, for giving us the opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing in Albany, and make sure that we stay grounded and connected to everyone back in New York City. So thank you.
You just heard Senator Julia Salazar on the work she's done this year to advance liberatory policies on crime and corrections. I'm Amy Wilson. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting 99.5 FM. We are the officially endorsed radio show of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America, and I'm here live with my comrade in New York City-DSA and Senator Salazar's organizing director, Ramon Pebenito. We'll hear more from him in just a moment. And I just have to say, I've been the recipient of the great pleasure of watching Ramon shadow box along with what Senator Salazar was saying in her interview that you heard just now. Julia Salazar was actually our first guest on Revolutions Per Minute all the way back in January of 2019. And she spoke about the struggle that was active at that time to forbid or fight back against the Amazon headquarters that was slated to be built in Long Island City and that greatly threatened workers and tenants living in Queens. Just puts me in mind of how far we've come since January of 2019, how far we still have to go, and how many liberatory movements are still developing and still struggling toward their goal. If you out there have responded to what Senator Salazar said on our show tonight and are thinking something like, hey, it's refreshing to hear an elected official, a state senator, talk about things like solidarity with people who are incarcerated, you should know that we here at Revolutions Per Minute see this show as part of the same political movement that sent Senator Salazar to Albany, and that is fighting for justice right now, today, for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. It's a small part, and it's a role that we are humbled to play. As a terrestrial radio station, WBAI is in the unique position of being able to broadcast through prison walls and reach people who are currently living in New York State's correctional facilities. We believe our incarcerated siblings should have access to the same quality of news, programming, music, analysis as everyone else, and WBAI and all the amazing local programs we broadcast can play a part in providing that. If this sounds good to you, please consider giving to the station on a monthly basis. If you give $25 in a year, you'll be a member of the station. You can participate in our station democracy to shape our programming and keep this station alive, vibrant, broadcasting, and part of struggles for justice for many years to come. To give to the station, please call 212-209-2950. That's 212-209-2950. Or you can go to WBAI.org If you find it in your heart to dedicate your contribution to revolutions per minute, we will certainly appreciate it. Thank you so much. So, Ramon, do you have any thoughts or reactions to what we just heard from Senator Salazar, or anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I thought she brought up so many points, and I just want to kind of shed some light on something I touched on earlier, and then something that was hinted at in her interview, which is the way that the correctional system is already avoiding full, true, genuine implementation of the Halt Solitary Act. Specifically, I kind of mentioned this clumsily earlier, but on the day that the AG report came out from Attorney General Tisha James, Senator Salazar was addressing a crowd with a massive poster of the basically new form of solitary confinement, which is a cage within a cage. No longer is it the boot, right? You're still in a parking lot size cell. It simply has another cage attached to it, which they are counting as recreational activity and exercise. It is solitary confinement by another name, to quote a survivor of this process. And it's completely unacceptable. And I just think that it shows that these victories are hard fought. And the hard part actually is not when the bill is signed, but when it's funded and implemented. There are so many programs and initiatives that have been passed for which there's simply no funding. And when you don't have any funding for it, you know it's not real. Yeah, I'm happy to. So as the COVID pandemic picked up last year, and last summer more specifically, there was a decision made to stop sending unhoused individuals into congregate shelters and instead house them in vacant luxury hotels. Okay? The hotels were vacant and they were available, and a program in which they were reimbursed was put into place. Not too long ago, the mayor decided to break down and dissolve this agreement, and on barely any notice, right? And I know that there's going to be some their official wording in the public statements regarding what notice is. Notice to the unhoused individuals who were asked to pack up their belongings on 2 or 3 days' notice, which flies against the official statement that they were alerted in June. In fact, one of the letters that an unhoused individual presented to the press was dated in June, but handed to the individual that week. So what is that? I don't know a more bald-faced lie and deception than that. As it pertains to where we are here in North Brooklyn, is we moved, or different activists started sensing that transfers are happening at these hotels, and there is a Delta variant right now that means that any mass location of people from places where they do have social distancing and efficient hygienic safeguards, which do exist in these different hotel improvised shelters. They don't exist in the public shelter system. It ties in directly to the austerity that Senator Salazar talked about, right? We are, in the activists, in the housing justice movement and the decarceral movement, we are focused oftentimes, and deservedly so, on the crisis right in front of us. And the crisis that we see in front of us is these unhoused individuals on barely any notice during a public and escalating pandemic being forced to move to shelters that are crowded, in which it is dangerous, right? And we're outraged about step one, right? But the because is because of the disgusting, inhumane aspects and conditions in the publicly funded or defunded every single time there's any kind of recession or economic slowdown. Actually, no, in good times they defund it as well. So I just want to be very, very specific here. Most people think of the Bedford Union Armory struggle from a couple years, 3 or 4 years ago. There's another aspect to the Bedford Union Armory, is the shelter on Bedford Atlantic Armory Shelter. It's a gigantic shelter in Crown Heights, and it has been labeled by people who have been there as the 9th circle of hell, okay? Drugs are dealt openly. Actual facts regarding the violence and crime that takes place within Bedford the Bedford Union Army Shelter, are hidden and concealed from the public. The New York Daily News did a wonderful expose 3 or 4 years ago that showcased this, that what is publicly reported is far lower in incidents of violence, drug abuse, arson, right, than what the public knows about. And I just want to give you one more concrete example. As I used to work in the shelter system very briefly over at the Doe Fund, a nonprofit shelter. There's 3 of them. There's actually one in Bushwick on Porter Avenue, and 9 out of 10 of the men in the Doe Fund were formerly incarcerated. And I was told that in Bedford Atlantic, the rats will crawl across your face as you try to sleep. Unhoused individuals who are in the shelter and who are trying to fight for their sobriety, their mental health and physical health, drugs are dealt openly. There's so much temptation. I cannot believe that this is something that is in place and persists, and that we are watching happen. So clearly we don't want them unhoused. We don't want the unhoused being put in a public health crisis or catastrophe at the congregate shelters like Bedford Atlantic, like across the city. No question, right? But before the pandemic, this was a problem. And all that we're talking about is how to react to the pandemic, not the original thing that just was made worse. So that's my comment on that. All right. So my personal experience, I want to get into that absolutely, but the way that this is connected is because of the bare fact that housing is a commodity, and something that we as socialists believe is a fundamental, essential, non-negotiable human right. Okay. Once you have this basic understanding that housing is a commodity, one that has been allowed to be monopolized and oligopolized by the wealthiest, most powerful interests, and then the wannabe small landlords who wish to be as big as the big boys, okay? Their confluence, their connivance has created a situation where housing is too unaffordable. Basic, small, tiny little apartments. I want to be very, very specific. Right. When I worked at the Doe Fund, I found something that has been verified by statistical data all over the city, which is that half the people who live in the average New York City homeless shelter have jobs. They simply cannot afford rent. On $15 an hour, you work at McDonald's or Wendy's. All right. Then they would come to the Doe Fund or whatever shelter they happen to be at, because I would hear these anecdotes, and they would simply use the shelter to sleep and take a shower and have a dignified place to sleep. Okay. And then they were gainfully employed. This myth that the homeless shelters are packed with jobless, as well as houseless, unhoused individuals, is a complete falsehood. It is, but by popularizing this or making people aware of this, we can really cut at the source, the commodification of housing, and the way that spilled over into an incident on Broadway over here in North Brooklyn, right at the border, right near Malcolm X, was directly related to this. A landlord without any moral scruples, right, of which there is almost no exception, was in charge, or he owns a property, right, that is actually zoned for manufacturing and commercial, right, and then he was renting this illegally to, local artists, right, and he was fined to take their money, right, illegally, right, with an illegal with a loft apartment that wasn't loft. And he was fined to take their money, and as long as they were able to pay. But as the crisis ensued, he became much more strident, started raising the rent on them, and at the same time, although he was unhappy that they weren't paying rent, he allowed them to use the vacant area of a closed or a vacant store at the base of this building. And they operated for over a year, a wonderful mutual aid camp, okay? It helped feed the malnourished and food insecure black and brown neighbors of the North Bed-Stuy, Bushwick community, right? We are in a food desert. The kale in a Bed-Stuy or Bushwick or Cypress Hills supermarket is more expensive than the Williamsburg fresh, Whole Foods, okay? They were doing this essential service, okay? And this landlord decided to finally rent out that lower level. And what does he do? He calls the cops. And the cops, rather
Wait,
than
I'm going to stop you right there, Ramon. That seems
That's
like
right.
a good breaking point in this story, and we'll get to the second half in just a second. But because we just have a couple minutes left in our Revolutions Per Minute show for tonight, I do want to give our listening audience an opportunity to call in and ask a question of you or give a comment on what we've heard tonight. If you'd like to do that, the number is 212-209-2877. That's 212-209-2877. And back to you, Ramon. So the landlord called the cops, and then?
Okay, and then very, very strangely, I'll just give you, cut straight to the climax here. For some strange reason, for a trespassing violation of a vacant store, at 1:58 p.m., I arrived on the scene. The activists, the wonderful organizers who were responsible for this mutual aid camp, they exist online. They can be researched. I don't want to call anyone out for this particular discussion, but they reached out because they were worried. They were scared. And the fact is that for a trespassing violation, the Strategic Response Elite Strike Force of the NYPD was deployed over on Broadway. And when I bring up the number 1:58 p.m., there's photographic and video evidence aplenty that document that the crowd, yes, there were people that were protesting the cops arriving to forcibly remove the mutual aid volunteers and organizers. No question, okay? But the crowd was not unruly, all right? And I would say this under oath, and I will say this under oath, actually. The crowd was not unruly. I was talking to the 83rd Precinct, and they had the situation in hand. So what we are facing, before we get into the violence that ensued, right, was a calm situation, no disorderly conduct. I will say that under oath. I say that at 1:58, all was calm. At 2:02 p.m., I took another picture of the 83rd Precinct calmly interacting with those around. Okay? You could easily walk 2 or 3 people, right, in a group through the space in front of the mutual aid camp, in front of the dilapidated store. Okay? Yet by the time you get towards 2:45, the Strategic Response Group has been summoned, they've mobilized, and they replaced the 83rd Precinct, who had been calmly, proceeding, getting ready to arrest the organizers. They were actually stood off to the side, despite being in a Latin-dominated community. None of their communications were in English. They made no concrete attempts.
None of their
to pacify
communications
the crowd.
were in
Yes.
Spanish?
Correct. Not a single one. There was no effort to try to coordinate any kind of conversation. And I will say this again under oath. Before what inevitably ensued, when the SRG is called, we saw this at the Barclays Center. You saw it. Others saw it even the day after this particular incident on Broadway, which is that the indiscriminate and unnecessary use of force. And I was actually personally injured, personally assaulted by a member of SRG as I was trying to defend an unarmed, peaceful demonstrator who was young and African-American female. And she was screaming her lungs out, and this is all on video too, as she was surrounded and basically wrestled to the ground against her will. And as I tried to help her, I was shoved brutally against the wall, and I could have, this is really about her, and this is really about those who went to jail that night and left with PTSD and other bruises and traumas. There exists for right now no real hard line at which they draw, the NYPD that is, before deploying this group of thugs.
Mm-hmm.
on lower income Black and brown communities.
No, I believe you. I've seen it myself. I've seen many videos. I know many comrades who have had the exact same experiences, especially with NYPD, SRG, Strategic Response Group, or more plain language, riot cops. They are an unaccountable strike force of the NYPD that tends to escalate rather than ever de-escalating any situation that they're ever sent into. And I just want to say, as a comrade, I'm so sorry that that happened to you. And we are unfortunately coming to the end of our show here tonight, and it looks like we've got a quiet audience. It's a thunderstorm out there. I've got this foreboding flash of lightning happening over my shoulder every couple minutes. So I understand why people are in a quiet mood, and this is also a heavy topic. But I do thank you very much, Ramon, for being here, for sharing your analysis as well as your experience. I'd love to give you a chance to end tonight's show with any final thoughts regarding our topics tonight: the housing crisis, mass incarceration, socialists in office, as well as let our audience know how they can follow Senator Salazar as she continues her second term as a state senator in Albany.
For Senator Salazar and for getting involved in these concrete forms of struggle, I'd encourage people those who are listening, check us out on Twitter. Obviously, check out our office. Give us a call. We'd love to have volunteers. This community of North Brooklyn, New York City as a whole, is struggling, right? And there are ways to get involved. There is no shortage of things to do, and there is a measure of progress that we are, as a collective movement, building. And these concrete victories are real. They're fragile. They're tenuous. We need you. We're calling out for support and solidarity.
Great. Well, I just felt that leap of sort of inspiration when you said that, Ramon. As you say, the victories are fragile and tenuous. The landscape is dark. We began our show with a reference to climate catastrophe that's barreling down upon us all, white, black, brown, rich, poor, every single day, although, of course, it is going to be the most marginalized who are hardest affected by climate catastrophe, as they are by every other social ill. And so that's why I thank you so much for your work and for being here with us tonight on Revolutions Per Minute. And we'll go ahead and close tonight's show. I'm Amy Wilson. You've been listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM, streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com. You can find us on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, or on Twitter at NYC-RPM. We are in a stormy night of socialism, but it is our solidarity, our collectivity, and our love for each other that will get us through to the dawn. Can I get a heck yes, Ramon?
Heck yes is a second.
Okay.